Good, good. Okay, then it's 2 minutes past 1, so we shall make a start. It's fantastic to see so many people joining our session this afternoon. We're currently at about 150 of you. I think it goes to show where we are at in the process of transition across to the 2022 version of the standards. And really just to say thank you to everybody who has taken the time to join. We are here to try and help and support. This is the next part in that process for our members through the Institute. Just to run through a little bit today, as I say, this is part of our support hub session. Some of you may be familiar with some of the support hubs we do around training and other aspects of pathology service. These next 3 sessions that we'll provide over the coming months are specifically around the transition to ISO 15189 2022. Today, starting with where we're up to in that transition process, gap analysis and risk. And then as we move through the year, we'll really track that feedback from UKAS assessors to help support you as much as you can in understanding where the challenging parts of the transition are, and really to share some of that learning. And then as we move into session 3, we'll look specifically at point of care testing, but each one of those will still keep an eye on the trend analysis and understand where we're getting the majority of non-conformity from, to help share that learning, as I say. So today, I'm sure you already know who I am, but for those of you that don't, I'm Debra Padgett and I'm past president of the Institute of Biomedical Science. I'm clinical pathology service manager at Northumbria and North East and North Cumbria network operational manager. But I've had quite an extensive career in pathology and had the pleasure of going through transition to the 2012 version of the standards from CPA. So been around the quality block a couple of times. Joining us today, we have some eminent speakers with us as well. So Alyson Bryant as our UKAS Healthcare Accreditation Specialist, who is leading the team from UKAS in that transition part of the process. So thank you ever so much, Al, for joining, and I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit more about yourself and your career as we progress through the session today. And then Nigel, who is joining us on behalf of the Institute and our Quality Management Specialist Advisory Panel, who is also our current IBMS Honorary Treasurer. So again, Nigel's had a long and illustrious career in quality management. He's considered an expert around risk and risk management, and so will help support us through what risk looks like today as well. So just to give you a brief outline of the session, you can read that on the screen as we talk, but really today is about audience participation. We'll ask Al to go first and she'll run through her presentation on gap analysis and the update on transition before we move to Nigel. I'll ask that we don't ask questions at that stage, but I'd be really, really keen for you to add questions into the chat and the Q&A box that I'll then try and moderate as we move into the second half of the session, where we'll open it up to the panel and try and cover off as many of those questions as we possibly can. You'll have noted that the session is being recorded and will be made available on the IBMS website, and we'll make sure that we share those details as we move through the session as well, so that anybody who hasn't been able to attend today will still have the opportunity to look at it. And what we also want to do is pull together any of the questions into an FAQ type article that will go into the biomedical scientist, but will also go onto the website so that we have that repository of information for people to be able to access and learn from as we move through the sessions. So with no further ado, Al, I'm going to hand over to you. I'll stop sharing and I'll let you share your presentation, and then over to you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Deborah. Is my presentation now visible? Hey,
yeah, we've got that.
That's perfect. Right, well, thank you everyone for attending. 196 people we're up to now. That's a little intimidating, but you know, that's all good. So as Debra said, my name's Al Bryant. Some of you may have seen me at Congress and various events over the last couple of years, but I'm the Healthcare Accreditation Specialist at UKAS. For my sins, leading on the 15189 transition and various other healthcare projects. I've been at UKAS, heading on for 10 years now, which I don't quite know where the time's gone. It feels like I've been here about 3 weeks and it's now 10 years. Before that, I was in the NHS for 15 years or so in cell path, various different roles. So I never actually worked in a 15189 accredited lab because I came over to the dark side before the transition happened, but I was heavily involved in the CPA to 15189 transitions in the first place. And this transition is nowhere near as bad, as painful, as big as anything. If you've lived through CPA to 15189, this is a piece of cake. So if I can make my slides move, yes. So what I'm going to talk to you for sort of 20, 25 minutes, depending how much I waffle about. I'm going to give you a bit of a review of the background about the 15189 transition, which should be nothing new, but I think it's always worth just a quick reminder about background and the UKAS process. I'll give you a bit of an update about where we are in terms of assessments and the progress that we've made since we started doing transition assessments. I've got a bit of a focus on the gap analysis because that seems to be an area that people, I don't want to say struggle with, but it's a new process. So I just want to give a bit of guidance about what you need to do with the gap analysis and the evidence you need to submit, and some early trends from transition assessments. Obviously, we haven't done a huge number of transition assessments yet, so the trends on it, they'll change throughout the... Oh, somebody, can whoever's mic is not muted, if I can ask you just to mute.
I've got them, Al.
I had a message saying somebody in the meeting had muted me. I haven't even started talking yet. Anyway, right. As I was saying, so I'll run through some of the early trends in the transition assessment, non-conformities, and at the future sessions that my colleagues are doing for this support session, they'll update those trends as we go through. So a really quick single slide about the background to the 15189 transition. Again, hopefully this is nothing new, but just in case. 15189 was revised and republished in December 2022. So the previous version was the 2012 version. This is now the 2022 version, lots of twos. The revision process is led internationally by the ISO committee, which is TC212, and the UK has input into that committee both by direct membership on the TC212 committee and via the UK BSI, what's called Mirror Committee. And the Mirror Committee in the UK is made up of a whole host of different stakeholders. IBMS is represented, UKAS is represented, MHRA, I think RCPAC is on there. Pick your organisation of choice, and there's some customers on there. There's BIVDA, there are equipment suppliers, manufacturers, etc. So you've got that really broad range across the whole of sort of medical laboratories and healthcare. We all were involved in seeing the drafts of 15189 and fed up through the ISO committee. So the UK was really strongly represented in that revision process. The major changes between the old version of the standard and the new are this bigger focus on clinical risk and patient impact, which for a pathology service, it's nothing new. We've had patients since pathology existed. Everything we do should be focused on patient impact and risk around there. It's just that the standard has got a bit more guidance, a bit more focus on that than perhaps the previous version did. And the inclusion of point of care, which seems to have slightly panicked some services. Point of care requirements are included in the new standard. This doesn't mean you have to have point of care accredited. Obviously, we would encourage point of care accreditation, but we have had a few queries saying, well, our point of care service isn't ready. What do? You carry on as normal. So if you're having your point of care service accredited, it will be to the 2022 version of 15189. Rather than to ISO 22870 as is currently. If you're not ready for accreditation point of care, don't panic. The publication of the standard, as I said, December last year, no, not last year, December 22, gosh, time's flying. And that initiated a 3-year transition process worldwide, which is managed worldwide by ILAC, the International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation. So they're kind of the, I don't know, the Uber UKAS. They're the high up superpowers of accreditation in laboratories. They've deemed that it's a 3-year transition process. Obviously, UKAS is managing that in the UK, but the 3-year deadline is not a UKAS deadline, it's an international deadline. Again, I've had a few people saying, oh yeah, UKAS will just extend the deadline if we're not ready. We don't have the power to extend the deadline of the transition. So at the end of next year, the 2012 version of the standard becomes obsolete. So we need to be sorted before then. And we will be sorted before then because we have a transition project and it's all going very well. So the 3 years we've split conveniently with the standard being published in December. We basically had year 1, year 2, year 3 was 2023, 24 and 25. 2023, so last year, we did a lot of preparatory work. We did the gap analysis within UKAS, looking at the previous version and the new version of the standard, worked out where the big changes were, worked out what hadn't really changed and everything in between. Did a lot of work training our assessors, both internal to UKAS and the contracted technical assessors that we use. And we did a lot of work on customer education and awareness. We went to basically any opportunity to do any stakeholder engagement, any seminars, any meetings, any events that we could. That was a variety, myself and my colleagues. Obviously, this was in collaboration with the IBMS and the RC Path and various other professional bodies. So last year was a lot about education and preparing people for the transition. This year, it looks nice and short on the slide, transition assessments, just transition assessments. That's all we're doing this year. So this year is the year that we're going to break the back of the transition assessments, and we want to get as many of them done this year as is humanly possible, which should be all of them, but obviously there's always a little bit of wiggle room where things go a little bit haywire perhaps. And then next year is, I'm sort of calling it my mopping up year. It's the year of granting the remaining transitions, so anyone who's assessed perhaps November, December this year, yeah, they will have findings potentially to clear still going on to the early part of next year. So having 25 as a kind of buffer zone means we can clear those findings, we can grant accreditation. There's always behind the scenes admin work that takes longer than anybody expects. And it is also that buffer zone if we've got any labs that are unsuccessful in their first transition assessment and they need another assessment. If that happens early this year, we'll endeavour to get the repeat transition assessment done later in the year. But again, we've got to be aware of the labs that are assessed October, November, December. If they're for any reason unsuccessful, we've got to have a bit of time in 2025 available to support them to get through their transition. So that's the background in a nutshell. Transition process. Again, hopefully this is nothing new, but worth reiterating. Very simply, follow the process that's detailed in the technical bulletins that we've published. Technical bulletins have been sent out to all of our accredited labs, and they're on the UKAS website in very high level oversimplifying summary of the process. Labs need to do a gap analysis, which I'll talk about in a bit, to look at obviously the gaps between the old standard, the new standard, and what is actually implemented in their services. Submit it to UKAS. We will then review the gap analysis and the associated documentation, and we'll follow up any queries on site at the subsequent surveillance or reassessment visit. As always, if we find any gaps, we will raise findings. You will submit evidence to clear those findings. We will grant accreditation to the new standard. Just like that. Always makes it sound very easy when you put it on paper, and then doing it is a bit more work. Oh, I can hear somebody chatting again. Just to confirm again, we've had a few queries about this. When you're granted accreditation to the new standard, your 4-year accreditation cycle doesn't change and your accreditation expiry date doesn't change. So if you have, for example, your first surveillance in your 4-year cycle this year alongside your transition assessment, next year, when you're accredited to the new standard, it will be your second surveillance in your 4-year cycle. You don't go back to the start again. So all of that just stays unchanged. So far with the transition, it's going very well. We've accredited 4 customers so far. One was late last year, and the rest of it this year. I think that's my right timelines. We've got about 30 in the decision-making queue. So the decision-making is the independent review process that we follow in UKAS, where somebody who hasn't been involved with the assessment reviews the assessment report and the UKAS records to make sure that we followed our own process and we've assessed in enough depth, etc. We've got at least 30 more, excuse me, that have been assessed. And the assessment manager is just finishing off the assessment report or tidying things up, ready to submit to us, so as decision makers. So it's going very smoothly. Generally gone pretty well so far. Obviously, findings have been raised, which we would expect, but the majority of them have been okay. There's always a but, though, isn't there? In any conversation, there's always a but. Been a few things that have come up that have partly surprised me, partly concerned me. Still, not so much, well, this month, but still, certainly in January, February, we were still hearing comments that some labs didn't know transition was taking place, which I don't quite, frankly, understand how anyone has missed the fact there's a transition, because there's a new standard published, there's information all over the place in whatever professional body they're involved with, whatever webinars, seminars, events, biomedical scientist magazine, the information is out there. So that was a bit of a surprise to me when we had some labs still not aware of the process or that it was happening at all. Some labs haven't read the process timelines, UKAS documentation. We've had a few comments saying, oh, we don't need our assessment till December 25. Just to reiterate, the 2012 version of the standard becomes obsolete in December 25. If you only have your transition assessment in December 25 and you've then got findings to clear, you will have a lapse in accreditation. There's just no getting around that. So that's why we're trying to get all the assessments done this year to give us next year as a bit of a buffer zone. And probably the concern that's been raised that's had the biggest impact is labs not necessarily picking up on the fact that we are assessing implementation of the new standard, not the intent to implement. The way I sort of explain in this, which I hope isn't coming across as patronising to anybody, when you do your gap analysis as a lab, if all you do is make a list of the gaps, you do your gap analysis and go, yeah, gap, 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 this bit we're fine, this bit we're fine, more gaps. What you're then handing to your UKAS assessment manager is a beautiful list of all the areas that you are not compliant, which then becomes a beautiful list of all the findings that we need to raise. And if there's too many, we can't grant accreditation. So what you need to be doing, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, is identifying your gaps and doing something about them. We're not expecting perfection. We're not expecting really any lab to be 100% compliant. It would be great if we did find that, but I'm not unrealistic. There will always be some gap in services and accreditation, but what we are wanting labs to do is pick up those major gaps, pick up the big changes, deal with those. I don't want to say less important, the less significant changes, if it's a case of an SOP needs to have the reference to 2012 updated to 22, but actually the process and what's being done on the ground hasn't changed, that can wait. That's not a deal breaker. It's all about assessing the implementation of the big changes. So just to talk a bit more about that and some areas that you can find some guidance about that. Our accreditation as the national accreditation body is based on assessment of objective evidence. Everyone's probably sick of hearing this. Every assessment manager will say, well, yes, but I need to see the objective evidence about that. And what we're looking for is evidence that an organisation is competent and compliant with the requirements of whatever standard we're assessing against. Obviously, for this audience, it's 15189, but that principle stands for any UKAS assessment to any standard. So the next few sort of paragraphs that I've got show the importance of reading the information and really reading and getting to grips with the information that UKAS is putting out, And the same principle applies for reading the new standard, new requirements, and really reading and understanding, and not thinking you've understood. Read it again. I've read the new standard so many times now, it's blown my mind. And there's still bits that I read and go, oh yeah, no, I hadn't registered that from my last readings. But the technical bulletin, the first technical bulletin we sent out in January 23, which really described the process of the transition, the way we're going to do it in UKAS. I'm not going to read all of the words on here, but it did say the first step is for each customer to identify the gaps between the policies and procedures they've currently got in place versus the new standard, develop an action plan for implementing new requirements. So right at the start of the very first communication, we said this is about get an action plan, about implementation. And in the same technical bulletin, we said you'll need to provide UKAS, sorry, I was thinking, oh, yeah, that is me. UKAS with a completed gap analysis detailing identified gaps and actions taken. Again, it's all about the actions, all about the implementation. And there's comments there about actions to comply with 15189.22. So we've had a few comments to say UKAS has changed the goalposts, that we're now looking for implementation, not just gap analysis. Actually, that was there right at the start of this. So it's worth going back and reviewing that technical bulletin if you're stuck or just want a refresher. On the gap analysis template itself, again, it emphasises that this is all about implementation of the standard. So it's the responsibility of the lab to identify the changes, make and implement any required alterations. The submission of the gap analysis should be supported by documentation showing how new or changed requirements again are met. Again, this one's quite important. Submitting documentation. We've had some gap analyses that haven't had sufficient documentation submitted with them. We've had some gap analyses with no documentation submitted. So the lab will put a comment in the gap analysis to say, yeah, we've updated this policy and it's now compliant, but not then provide the policy to us. So we can't, we have no objective evidence that that requirement is met. And again, key, excuse me, new or changed requirements. So the focus of the transition assessment is on the new requirements and the big changes. There are lots of smaller changes, but we've categorised in the gap analysis the changes as major, minor, new and structural. We are focusing on the major and the new changes because the other changes, basically, if you're compliant with 2012, you're compliant with 22. So there's less of a focus on there. And again, on the gap analysis template, it talks about implementation will be assessed. So it's very clearly there in the guidance and evidence we sent out. And again, we sent out a new technical bulletin in January this year, just giving a bit of a progress report and clarifying some of these requirements. Reiterated the sending in of the gap analysis of the actions taken. I think the second bullet point, again, is one that people haven't necessarily taken hugely on board. We expect labs to have updated relevant policies, procedures, SOPs, etc. Not every policy, procedure, etc. Pick up the big gaps, pick up the major changes, do something about them, have your action plan for the lesser changes, but got to show us that the big changes and the new requirements have been implemented. One of the things I do want to emphasise is in the gap analysis that we've created in the template, we've defined, as I said, major, minor, new, etc. requirements. When accredited labs are doing their own gap analysis, you might disagree. You might find something that we think is minor, and you said, actually, looking at what we actually do on the ground, in our daily lives, in our service, that's actually quite a major change. So if you identify something that we said is minor, you say is major, do something about the majors. Don't only focus on the majors that we've identified. Right, I thought it would be useful to go through, I think I've got 3 examples that have been anonymised but taken from real gap analyses that have been submitted to UKAS and have been assessed by one of my colleagues. No particular order, I just picked out some what I thought were interesting examples. So the first section is about non-conforming work. So clause 4.9 in the old version of the standard, 7.5 in the new. Some major changes here around consideration of clinical impact, etc. So we've defined it as major, and this lab quite sensibly in the gap analysis that they submitted to UKAS has split their actions. So we've done this, we've completed this bit. These bits we're still working on, still to do. So looking sort of the wrong way round, the completed actions, they said we've added a change request to SOP2 to include these additional requirements around responsibilities, authorities, and clinical significance. They wanted to link it to another SOP. I can't remember what the other SOP was, but they felt that would be useful to clarify their process and then update the authority for resumption of work. So SOP2 was the SOP for identification and management of non-conformities, unsurprisingly. So this lab said we've submitted a change request, and because it's in the complete section, we've done that. We've implemented the new policy procedure. They provided the updated SOP as evidence when they submitted their gap analysis. So the assessment manager went through the gap analysis, said the lab said they've done this. They sent us the evidence to show that they have done it. Job done. No fine to be raised because they've updated their documentation in line with the new standard. In the to-do bit of this area of the gap analysis, they'd raised a change request to a different SOP where they wanted to add the process for risk assessing the audits to develop the audit schedule and look at impact and extent for their non-conformity records a bit more. SOP 1 was the audit SOP. So obviously this part of the gap analysis is non-conforming work, but the audit SOP is around non-conformities being raised as a result of audit. So there's an obvious link. That same SOP was mentioned later in the gap analysis against the audit clauses. So 414.5 in old language, 883 in new. Because that SOP hadn't been updated, it was just a change request had been raised and it was on the to-do list. The lab didn't provide a copy of the SOP because it hadn't changed. And because it was a major gap for both non-conforming work and the audit, there's some major changes as well. This was raised as a finding because we didn't have evidence that the new requirements had been implemented. The finding was actually raised against the audit clause, not the non-conformity clause, because it was the whole policy and process that needed updating. But hopefully that sort of clarified the way we're looking at gap analyses and thinking about the evidence we want to see. The next example is been classified as a major change. It's a major change because there's major changes to the personnel requirements. This specific bit technically is a new requirement, but it falls under kind of the major change of all the personnel requirements. So this clause is around personnel authorisation. So it's around authorising staff to do any activities actually, but with specific examples of signing off verification reports, using the LIMS and releasing results. So we said this is a major gap because the term authorization wasn't in the previous version of 15189. So something that we need to look at in the transition. This lab said there was no gap. So they said, actually, what we've got in place already is compliant. Yeah, they were quite happy that what they were already doing was compliant with the new standard. And they listed quite a few policies in their gap analysis. And I put some examples here about the validation or verification policy, equipment management, and a few LIMS related policies. They didn't provide any of the policies as evidence. So in the gap analysis review before going on site, we had nothing to go on. So the assessment manager had a query about that already. And then when she went on site and looked at some of these policies, there wasn't actually anything in them to talk about authorization of personnel. There was no process for how personnel get authorized. There was no sort of list of authorized personnel, or in a competency assessment, there was nothing around that authorization piece of work. So actually, our finding was raised because we had no evidence of implementation. So that's an example of a major change that the lab could have had it sus. They could have already had requirements around this. There would be no reason why they shouldn't have had it before. They thought they'd got evidence of compliance, but didn't provide us with anything up front. And when we went on site, that there was nothing that provided that assurance of compliance with the new standard. The next and last example I wanted to go through was a minor change. So this is around documentation of examination procedures, so SOP content and layout. 553 in the 2012 version, 763 in 2022. I keep thinking if I say these numbers out loud enough, they will sink in and I'll stop referring to the old clauses and start referring to new ones, but it's taking a lot of time to get the numbers sorted. But 736 we're looking at here. So in the 2012 version of the standard, there was a long list, a long bullet point list of requirements of what had to be included in SOPs. In the new version, it's stripped back a bit. It's paraphrasing. It basically says SOPs have to be fit for purpose. So that's acknowledging that different disciplines, different tests, different countries, different services will need more or less or different information in their SOPs to make them effective. So having a big long list of bullet pointed requirements, which then, labs put in not applicable, not applicable, not applicable, it's not necessary really. So it's only a minor change because any SOP that is compliant with 2012 in terms of layout will inherently be compliant with 22. So we're not doing any specific transition assessment of SOP templates and layouts. This lab identified there wasn't a gap, which is absolutely fine. And they listed a number of their policies. So it's document control policies, SOP templates, and a few other examples. They didn't provide anything as evidence because they said, well, nothing's changed, so there's nothing to provide. We didn't do a specific assessment of this area as part of the transition assessment, but on any UKAS assessment, you see SOPs, you see documents, you see policies. That's a major part of the assessment process. So the assessor did actually comment in the transition assessment report that although it's a minor gap, no specific assessment was needed. She did see evidence of compliance through just the general assessment process. So if we see evidence of compliance, we're always going to comment on it because, bluntly, why wouldn't you? So that's all the gap analysis examples I wanted to run through. Just going to spend a few minutes now talking about the trends and findings that we found so far. As I said, it is still fairly early days, but we are seeing some early trends, none of which are actually particularly surprising, but useful just to point out what we're seeing so far. So one of the trends is around this clause 623, around authorization of personnel. Because it's a new requirement, labs just haven't quite rolled out that process yet. It's not a difficult requirement in terms of authorising appropriate people to sign off verification reports, release reports and use the LIMS. It's just not quite there in terms of being embedded in lab processes. Clause 7.3, every time I look at this, I think I really need to split this down further. 7.3 is a massive section in 15189-22, because this is basically the whole examination process. So it's verification, validation, doing the tests, it's EQA, it's IQC, it's measurement of certainty, etc., etc. But within 7.3, we're starting to see a theme of lack of evidence of clinical involvement in sign-off of verification reports, which links partly to 623 as well. This is something that we've been sort of gently nudging at in UKAS for a few years, because what we've seen, certainly in the early days of 15189-2012, is verification reports signed off by normally a quality manager, which I'm not belittling in any way, shape, or form. If you're a quality manager, don't be offended, but quality managers will not necessarily understand the clinical impact of a verification. I'm thinking of myself as a cell path BMS. If I was in a pan pathology quality manager role and I was asked to sign off a verification for a biochemistry assay, I don't have the first understanding in any way, shape or form about biochemistry technical details. I, as quality manager, could sign off that our process has been followed. Yeah, the verification report is complete, all the boxes are filled in, all the evidence is saved in the right place, etc. I'd need my clinical staff to sign off to say, actually, this test is fit for purpose. Has the verification been sufficient? Has it used enough samples? Has it used the highs and the lows and the borderlines, or the positives and the negatives, whatever the test result is? Has it been verified on the correct patient population? You know, if it's being used in a paediatric service, but the verification has been done on adult samples, is that relevant? Is that applicable? All that sort of piece of work, you've got to have that clinical involvement in. So really, sign off of verification reports needs a bit of technical, a bit of clinical, and a bit of quality management as a to make sure all the bases are covered. We've seen a trend of findings with IQC processes, nothing specific within IQC, just a general sort of indication that perhaps labs haven't looked at the IQC requirements quite as much as they should have done. So it's worth just going back and reviewing the IQC requirements of the new standard to make sure that you really are doing what you have to do to be in line with the standard. The next clause trend that we found is around non-conformity records, clause 7.5. So that lack of evidence that clinical risk and patient impact has been taken into account. So something has happened, you've got a non-conformity, you've dealt with that one incident, that one patient. Have you then looked at whether it's affected other patients? You know, if an analyzer has been playing up, are there other patient results that have been affected? If there's been, I don't know, reagent made up wrong and it's been spotted on this one patient sample, has it affected other patient samples? What is the impact to the patient? So it may be that you've had a slightly delayed turnaround time for a test, but actually the test result was still back with the clinician before the patient had their follow-up. So in real terms, direct patient impact, there isn't any. Have you sent out an incorrect result, which has then meant somebody has had incorrect treatment? Obviously, that's potentially a huge impact. So it's that thinking a little bit wider and a little bit further that we haven't quite seen the full evidence of that yet. And the last trend we've seen is around the audit planning, audit scheduling, that traditionally labs have had a sort of 4-year audit schedule, and they just roll this on. You know, you get to the end of year 4 and you start again at the beginning of year 1. And while that makes sure everything is covered, it's not risk-based. So the whole standard is about risk-based thinking. So when you've got, when you sit down planning your audit schedule, why are you auditing what you're auditing when you're auditing it? Have you got a new method that you think, actually, we really ought to do another audit of that in 3 months' time, just to make sure that it has been properly embedded, the training that we've done has been appropriate, that we've had some more EQA results by then, so we'll do a sooner audit than perhaps we would normally have done? Have you got a method that is really complicated, really high risk, but you only do twice a year? You know, do you need to audit every time that method is done? Do you audit it once a year? If you only audit it once in a 4-year cycle, is that too high a risk? Up to you as a lab to decide. And then you've got the other side of the coin. You've got the very stable, unchanging, been used for decades methods. When I was putting this talk together, I was thinking about pearl staining, that I've been out of labs for 10 years. I reckon if I went into a lab tomorrow and was given the SOP, I could do a pretty good pearl stain, I would hope. Therefore, yeah, that's a stable method. People have done it for years. Do you need to audit it very often? Or actually, are you happy that it's so well embedded that you don't need to audit it very much at all? Conversely, I've just said I haven't done one for 10 years and I'd be fine. is there a risk that people who've been in the lab for a long time might have the same attitude and go, oh, I don't need to follow the SOP, I know what I'm doing, and actually they might be perhaps a little overconfident, so therefore do you need to audit it more often? So there is no one size fits all. You've just got to sit down when you're planning your audit schedule and think about what the risks are, what's the highest risk, what do you need to audit more often, what do you need to audit less often, and have that justification. And I think people are perhaps a little concerned around this because they think UKAS assessors are going to come in and go, no, that's wrong, that's not the right frequency to assess that audit. You know your service. If you have risk assessed your service, your audit programme, etc., and that is the decision based on technical needs, clinical needs, quality management needs, etc., push back to UKAS assessors. They'll kill me for saying this, but push back, because you know your service, and the whole standard is about patient care, risk-based approach, knowing your own service. and you are the experts on that. So that is all I was going to say today. Hopefully that's been useful. I'll hand back over to Deborah and Nigel to carry on.
Thanks ever so much, Hal. That was really, really helpful, and it's good to see kind of how the transition process is moving forward. But also I know that we have had lots of questions about gap analysis and what it means around just raising gaps and how far through the process of actioning and implementing do you need to be as part of that first transition visit. It's really lovely to see we're starting to get some questions into the chat. We'll come back to those and pick those up after Nigel has spoken, just so for those of you that are on your lunch break, you get the benefit of both speakers, and then we will take those questions at the end. So I'm going to hand over to Nigel, who's going to talk to us about risk management and the risk-based approach around 15189. So Nigel, over to you. Thank you.
Just bear with me a second while I click all the right buttons to get you. Just need to put it in PowerPoint mode. Okay, can you see that now? Is that good, Deborah?
Yeah, we've got that. Thanks, Nigel.
Okay, so as I say, I'm Nigel Coles. I'm IBMS Honorary Treasurer, and I've been a quality manager for too many years. Part of the role of being Honorary Treasurer is to chair the Finance and Risk Committee. So risk is on my agenda pretty much on a daily basis now. So just going back through my career, I did retire a couple of years ago and came back part-time, but first time I went on a risk management course was actually in May 1990. So that's 32 years ago or 34 years ago now. So it's not been around a long time. The fact that it's just gone into the UKAS standards, the ISO standards in any meaningful way is, I don't quite understand why it's taken so long, but there you go. It is what it is. So I could talk to you about risk for the rest of this week and probably most of next week if you wanted me to. So I've picked kind of 4 key areas that I thought I could cover in the next half hour or so. I'll try not to waffle too much. So the areas about what is actually risk, the risk process, risk-based thinking, because we've already heard that several times already. And the problems most people have is actually identifying which risks need to be recorded. So I'm talking about risks in general. I know ISO 15189 talks about clinical risks and risk to patients, but the same process goes on with strategic risks or health and safety risks or project risks or whatever you want. So the same theory applies. So what is risk? Oxford English Dictionary says it's a situation involving exposure to danger. That's pretty basic, I guess, and doesn't really cover it very well, I don't think. There is an ISO standard 31000 that was published in 2018. I did mean to double check to make sure that was the latest version, and I just realised I've forgotten to do that, but I believe it's the latest version. If you haven't seen this, then it's always worth getting a copy or getting hold of a copy through the library to take a read of it. It is useful, but they talk about risks, effect of uncertainty on objectives, I thought that's a far better description of what a risk is than the Oxford English Dictionary. Some key words in there. One's about risk, which is key to what we're talking about, so I'm not going to go, but the effect, so there has to be some threat or opportunity that's going to benefit you, add value to it, or take the value away from your organisation to become a risk. And it's about an uncertainty, so it's not about getting rid of risks. You very rarely can do that, and if you do get rid of all your risks, then you're probably not going to advance as an organisation too well, and you certainly won't be able to read your objectives, whether that's your quality management objectives, whether it's the clinical objectives you've got, whether it's your financial objectives or whatever you got. We're talking about the risks, the effect of uncertainty on your objectives. So every organisation I've been involved in does risk slightly differently. Nobody can tell you which is the correct way and which is a bad way of doing it. But I'm going to highlight at various points throughout the things that you really need to do to make sure you've got a suitable risk management process. Right, I'm not advancing my slide for some reason. Try again. Oh, there we go. So I'm just having a quick problem with my IT at the minute. But so yeah, what does risk actually mean? So first thing to point out is it's around uncertainty, and probabilistic. So I was talking back a couple of years back now to a guy from the who works for the Environmental Agency, and he was talking about risks that happen once every 100 years environmentally. But he was keen to point out to everybody he was talking to that if it happens once every 100 years, that doesn't mean to say it's going to happen once in the next 100 years. It could happen several times. It could happen several times tomorrow. But if you took it over 1,000 years, then it might happen 10 times. But it could happen tomorrow. It's not going to wait 100 years and then suddenly happen, and it could happen tomorrow. So they have actually don't, in their risk management policy in the Environmental Agency now, they don't take in probability. The probabilistic aspects is largely ignored because they know it's going to happen. Floods, they know, are going to happen on a fairly regular basis. The other thing to note is the outcomes can be two-sided, so they could be positive or they could be negative. It gives you opportunities for improvement, for quality improvement. It could be a threat on objectives, and is likely to be. If it's not a threat on objectives, I would ask whether that really is a risk or just an issue that you need to deal with. Certainly gives you an opportunity, but risk is actually a human trait. We've all taken numerous risks this morning so far. We've all been taking them since the day we were born. It's part of our fight and flight response. So this idea of human thinking about risk-based thinking is kind of a little bit strange, because we are human, and that's what we do, and that's what every kind of living animal and organism kinds of do. It's looking to deal with its threats, and it's looking to take advantage of its opportunities. So I'll come back to risk-based thinking in a second. For some reason my slides keep stopping. So what's the importance of risk management? One, it helps you make intelligent decisions. It should give you that objective evidence that that Alyson was just talking about in making a decision. If you make more intelligent bets, then you're going to become more successful, you're going to achieve more. You'll be able to focus on your priorities, on the priorities of the organisation. You're needing to look at preserve your current status, your current assets and where you are, the current value you get. But we need to create more value as time goes on. We're always looking to create more value, otherwise we just stand still. It helped to create transparency. As Alyson was saying earlier, she needs to see objective evidence, and this helps to provide that objective evidence. In terms of finance, one of my responsibilities at the IBMS is to look after to oversight the investment strategy, and what we're trying to do there is to minimise the downs and maximise the ups. So making sure we don't lose too much money, but making sure that we advance our objectives in maximising our money. Ignoring risk management has catastrophic events, as we've seen at Piper Alpha. I don't know if Piper Alpha was a oil platform in the North Sea that burnt down and sank, and a huge, I think it was Shell. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Shell. In fact, I went to a training course by the guy who was the risk manager investigation officer on the Piper Alpha investigation, and he was a fascinating guy to talk to, and basically was saying that they took their eye off the ball. Their objective was to make better use of resources rather than the safety of the platform. They were saying that their objective was to get more production out of the platform rather than safety of the platform, and focusing on the wrong risks had a catastrophic effect. Very similar to the Deepwater Horizon problem, another oil rig based in Mexico Bay, that I think that was BP, exactly the same. Thought they could save some money, increase resources for other things, and a catastrophe happened. Kodak's a famous one that ignored risk management process. They couldn't see the opportunities that digital imaging would hold, and who's heard of Kodak these days? Rarely see them. They're stuck with their old film-based images. And even Mid-Staff's scandal that happened a few years ago, they were an organisation that focused on some key performance task instead of patient safety and staff awareness and things like that. So ignoring it can be absolutely catastrophic for your organisation. So why do we do it? Risk management is expectation from a lot of professional bodies now. I don't think the Institute's got a statement saying they expect their members to do risk management, but a lot of professional bodies do it, especially in the kind of finance industries and construction industries and so forth. ISO 15189 says we should do it as well, especially the 2022 version. The previous version didn't really deal with it very well, and it was a little bit confused about what it wanted. UK Corporate Governance Code tells you have to do it, but that's a voluntary code. But then there's couple of UK laws that tells you have to do risk management. The Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. In I think it was 1989, there was an introduction of the Management and Health and Safety Regulations, which actually stipulated that you must do risk management in health and safety aspects. UK Companies Act says it as well. You must take part in risk management activities. So risk management is not about not taking risks. You have to take risks in order to progress, but it's about taking the right risks. It's about the rewards you're going to get, and it's about you protecting your current assets and your current value that you have. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the risk process first. So this is taken again from ISO 31000, exactly the same version, 2018, and it splits the risk process into 3 core steps. The first one's about scope and context and criteria. The second one's about risk assessment. Third one's about risk treatment. So going to scope, context and criteria, this is how are you going to deal with the certain variety of risks that you've got to you? So I do know experience to one organisation that had a risk management policy for clinical risk. They had another one for financial risks, and they had another one for non-clinical risks. So you've got 3 policies there, 3 different ways of dealing with risk management, all absolutely fine, but it's just make sure ensuring those things are described in some sort of risk management policy. It needs to say who's going to be responsible for risks, what's your risk tolerance. So risk tolerance is most people, I guess, would are rating their risks on a RAG rating type of scale. Whereby you have to take some action as opposed to you're happy to take that risk because of the advancements that you're going to make. So it's also talks about risk appetite. It needs to talk about risk appetite. So I'm sure you've all been in laboratories where somebody's suggested something, but the management says, oh, we're not prepared to do that at the moment because we've got so many other things going on at the moment, things like limbs replacements and consolidation of activities and development of hubs and spokes, that perhaps changing particular pieces of equipment at that particular time is too much of a risk. So that's stating what the appetite is for your organisation to take risks. The less appetite, the less your progress, the more appetite you take, potentially the more you'll progress, but also potentially that you'll come a cropper somewhere and somehow. So all that usually goes into a policy. Some people have the actual process of how they're going to do risk management in their policy. Some departments and places have it's slightly different, have a procedure to deal with it. So the risk assessment is actually separated again into how you're going to identify your risks, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later because that's the usual question people ask me is about how they identify certain risks. How they're going to do risk analysis. I think most people are aware about that, about the multiplying the consequences by the probability and coming up with a score. Most of the NHS do it on a 5x5 basis matrix. Other people use various other different scores, 3x3 I've seen 4x4, I've seen 10x10s. They're all correct, no problem with any of them, so long as it priorities the important risks that you need to deal with. So then you need to evaluate the risks. What are the causes and what are the consequences? Now, where risk management falls down is they do all that and then the treatment area. So similar to what Alyson was saying earlier, you need to define your risks and you need to take those, you need to develop the actions, identify the actions and actually complete the actions. It's not good enough just to say, this is the action we will take. You've got to complete the actions, and that's where most risk management systems fall apart. Talk a little bit more about that later. So there's 2 parallel processes along with that. There's communication and consultation, and it's important that you do that. The risk management is not responsible for the entire risk management system, so we all take different risks. I used to tell the story about my next door neighbour who used to jump out of airplanes at 15,000 feet every weekend or every other weekend, and yet she was absolutely scared stiff of creepy crawlies and spiders in a house. And I can't understand the different risk management assessment of the different risks that are going on in her head at that particular moment. How you can jump out of a plane at 15,000 feet and not be you can still keep it together. The other one is about monitoring review. So once you've done it, you need to monitor all the actions to make sure they're being completed and assess them, do risk as you've got once all the actions have been complete. And underpinning all this is recording and reporting. Okay, so this is exactly the same in a diagram form. This is taken from ISO 31000, and it's just been copied basically, but recognising that. So let me just have a quick drink. So next, risk-based thinking. So I first came across this in 2015 when the ISO 9001 standard came out. And I was a little bit confused by it because, as I said, as human beings, we are risk-based thinking bodies. We do it all the time. The number of risks you've taken this morning so far is probably dozens and dozens of them. The risk of coming to this meeting for an hour and a half to listen to two speakers and you're losing time that you could perhaps better spend elsewhere, or you might be thinking I'm gaining something. So you are taking a risk just coming to here. You probably took a risk by setting the alarm this morning. You know, you control there to set the alarm to make sure you got to work on time. We're doing it all the time, whether you came by train or public transport or drove. Again, there's a risk-based thinking process going on there. So risk, this is my definition of risk. Difficult to find a definition of it. I couldn't find one, so I created one of my own. So risk-based thinking involves proactively considering potential risks and opportunities in the decision-making process throughout an organisation. Yeah, so this approach acknowledges that all activities involve uncertainty. So the key word is all activities. Everything you do has got some degree of uncertainty, and you can and the decision to do it or not do it is would be based on a risk assessment of some sort. And that managing risks effectively is essential for achieving your objectives. Okay, I'm happy to discuss that further or questions around that later if anybody's got a name. So there's some key aspects of this. It creates a framework for decision making, risk-based thinking. For me personally, it's the way I make my decisions. And of course, I don't record everything down on paper. It's just the way my head works. You need to anticipate risks. If you don't anticipate risks, you're not managing that uncertainty. It's too late. That's an incident then. Integration with processes, so you need to look at it with all your processes that go on, the procedures, what are the risks for each of the items in that procedure, what are the clinical risks, how the patient's going to be affected. It can be quite overwhelming if you're not very careful, so I'm going to look at some of the issues around that in a second. It is about balancing risks and opportunities. Yeah. And you need to have something in mind about how you're going to do that. Again, your personal ones will be different to the department ones, will be different to the people in the department, will be different to the head of the department, will be different to the chief exec. So it's important that you talk around risks as much as you can, because you each have a personal opinion about what's risky and what's not. It enables you to get involved in your continual improvement. It's a proactive, and you need to look at it system-wide. So I cannot see any reason why you would not do this risk-based thinking, but you do it. It's nothing new. You do it since the day you were born. You've been doing it, and every living organism on the planet does it. One of the problems we've got is around documentation, because all this could create a huge bureaucratic nightmare if you're not very, very careful. So the documentation that you require around this risk-based thinking, I think I've got about, what have I got, 7 or 8 items on here, is a risk management policy. You definitely need that to start with, because that drives your risk management system really, and deals with how you're going to process all those risks and score them and so forth. So I said some people have a risk management policy, some people have a risk plus in addition a risk management process document. They'll have a risk register. You need to keep all this information somewhere about how you're going to do it. Risk register can be in sorts of different forms. Some of us have probably got Datix, which is hard work doing risks via Datix. I always feel it's far easier to do it in other aspects. The easiest way is just to do it in a regular table using Excel or Word. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second as well. What is your risk assessment methodology? How are you going to score it? Are you going to do a 10 by 10? Are you going to do a 5 by 5? Are you going to do a 3 by 3? What is the sensitivity you want to find risks, the key risks? Again, the treatment, I'll say this again and again and again, the failure of risk management systems and risk thinking is if you don't develop treatment plans and you don't take those actions to reduce the risk. So it's exactly the same as message that Alyson was giving earlier. It's important that's where risk management fails, is that the filling in the paperwork and doing all the bureaucracy around it becomes more important than actually dealing with the risk and putting actions in place. How are you going to communicate these risks to people? Who are you going to communicate it to? Where they're going to go? Who needs to know what? And how are you going to review the risks? How are you going to audit around the risk process? Tends to be the audits are quite disappointing, most of the risk audits, because they tend to be, are you completing the software, are you keeping the paperwork all up to date? And that's not really the point of risk management. The point of risk management is to reduce the risk, complete those actions and to reduce the risks. What training and awareness sessions need to be put in place so when people understand what risk management is about and what the risks are. And the one thing that I've added to my this list more recently, and certainly since I've retired, is the lessons learned. I didn't do this when I was quality management, risk management on a daily basis, and I've watched slowly over the 2 years since I've retired, people relearning the lessons that we've learned 2, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years back, taking out controls and learning the lesson the hard way because I thought it was waste. Learning the lessons the hard way, and it's not been good. So that's something I wish I had done in my career over the last 20 odd years and so forth. So there are obviously problems with documentation. As I've said earlier, this could become a very bureaucratic exercise, and that's not the objective. The objective, as I said, is to reduce the risks, take the actions to reduce the risks. So the problem with a lot of risk management is the completion of the documentation becomes the objective. It is not. We often lose sight of the actual improvement. So the documentation is important because you've all heard risk assessors, UKAS assessors say, well, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Not strictly true, but I understand from where they're coming from. Even if it's not documented, things have still happened, but you can't prove it. There's no objective evidence to prove it. So strategies for overcoming excessive documentation. Deborah, how am I doing for time? I'm just rattling on. I'm not thinking about time.
Yeah, we can pull it together in the next couple of minutes, Nigel. That'd be great, so we can get through some questions. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it might be important. The last few slides I will go through very quickly, but there's quite a few slides. So tailored strategy for overcoming excessive documentation. You need to tailor the documentation to the situation. So a lot of strategic risks will need a lot of evidence for organisations, for chief executives, for the exec level, but most of the risks you deal with you can simplify in a line of an Excel spreadsheet. Very easy to do, just to indicate that you've thought about these things and what you've done about them and whether you're happy with them or not. Again, emphasising the practical application of completing actions and reducing the risks, making sure you focus on outcomes rather than completing the documentation is always helpful. Some digital applications can help automate the process and reduce the burden. But some make it so difficult, some that I've used. Again, a training support. And the other key thing, apart from completing actions, is regular discussions and reviews around risks and updating your risk action plans and so forth. So one thing UKAS will want to know about, I'm guessing, is a risk management credibility that you have. And to do that, you need executive leadership support. The top leaders in your organisation, whether it's your department or your wider organisation, need to be engaged with this. It's not for the quality manager or the risk manager or to do this and it's his sole intention. Everybody needs to get involved, but especially the senior support, executive support. It needs to be integrated with your strategic planning. It needs to have a robust risk management, risk governance structure. So which risks are you going to escalate up to the chief exec and so forth, or the chief medical officer, or whoever it is in your organisation. So it's also about demonstrable resilience. So business continuity plans comes into that as well. So that those need to be demonstrable and they need to be tested, and making sure you can do it when the time comes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about identifying risks, and I don't think I've got time to talk about this in any meaningful way. So I'm going to skip through a lot of these and just introduce you to some of the ways I'm doing it, and maybe a further talk at some point I can talk about just about identifying risks. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about how risks develop. They develop from causes. When those causes can create an event or a hazard that you don't want to happen, and that can cause consequences. So you've got two places where you can control these risks from developing and having significant consequences. You can do preventative actions, which stops the event happening or reduces the likelihood of an event happening or a hazard coming to fruition. And then you've got mitigating actions. So mitigating actions are actions you take once the event has happened that you take to reduce the consequences. Okay, so a business continuity plan might be a mitigating action. Control might be, I don't know, using I don't know, I can't think of anything at this particular moment. The risk register, so it needs to be a description of the risk. A risk statement needs to be in the format of, if there is a cause, then this event will happen with the following consequences. So that if-then statements, and it makes it clear then exactly what the risk is. So the risk statement is to include the causes, or causes, could be more than one, the event that you don't want to happen, and the consequences that might arise to. It's got to have an assessment of the impact and probability. It needs to have a risk owner who's owning this risk, and there needs to be an action plan. Can't stress enough, I talk about actions. So a simple risk register could be 5 items. So I'll just quickly go through these. I can talk about them more in detail at another meeting if you want to. The most quickest way to identify risks is to go through a structured what-if technique. I'm happy to have these. You can have these slides off me. So what I've done with all these techniques really is describe the technique a little bit. I've provided a bit of a checklist here for you to look at and use, and then some comments about the technique. So this, in terms of, I've looked at SWIFT. So the next one is about hazard and operability studies, exactly the same format. Further comments, failure mode effect analysis, you've perhaps heard of. Again, various questions and the way we document it, and some comments around it. Fault tree analysis, event tree analysis, fishbone diagrams, influence diagrams, goal structuring notation. Not really a risk identifier, but it's a way of providing evidence of claims made. So a lot of IT systems now are going through this. If you've implemented an IT system, you might be familiar with goal structuring notation. So this is where a manufacturer will claim certain things, and you can go through this goal structuring notation to see if what the risks are around what the claims are. I've used the term brainstorming. I know that upsets people, and I've upset people in the past by using the term brainstorming. I apologise if that's upsetting anybody, but I really can't think of another word to use, and most people still use it. So apologies if I've upset anybody. But with brainstorming, the key thing is to try and identify as many solutions as possible before you decide which ones you're going to use and which ones you're not going to use. And that was pretty much my talk. So I'm happy to answer any questions now. Sorry if I've gone a little bit over time, but I think we've got a bit of time.
No problem at all.
Find a way of stopping sharing this.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, Nigel, and thank you, Al, as well. The minute you get into risk-based thinking, methodology, and all of the various different tools and toolkits that you can use around risk management, as Nigel started his talk by saying, you could probably spend a week talking about it, and definitely something that we'll probably need to pick up in a further session, Nigel. But thank you for giving us that introduction. Keen to move on to some questions, and some have come through on the chat and some were submitted ahead of time, so let's just have a look at some of those. Al, I'm going to throw back to you first, because as you can imagine, there's probably a few more for you than there is for Nigel, and I'm really not so sure why, but here we go. So, where you have submitted a gap analysis to UKAS pre-visit, but then made some significant inroads in action since then, do we notify our assessment manager to submit the updated version, or do we wait until the visit and go through those?
I think it would be worth having a conversation with each assessment manager, because it will depend on what their diary looks like as to when they're actually going to review the gap analysis. I mean, if they're out on assessments and they're going to review the gap analysis at quite short notice before your assessment, I'm sure they'd appreciate the most up-to-date document. If conversely they've got a bit of time in advance and then no time directly before the assessments, yeah, I think it's a classic. It depends. Talk to your assessment manager, and I think it will vary depending on their diary and how well they know your service, etc.
And I think that's a common thing throughout this whole transition process, Al, really, isn't it? Open up that dialogue with your assessment manager. UKAS are there to help and support. Your assessment manager already knows your service, knows where you're at, and probably has a good understanding of where you are already at for a transition. So just have the conversation. And I think that's probably one of the key learnings from today. Read the standard.
Yeah. Yes.
And have the conversation.
And also, I mean, just kind of to build on that slightly, not just about the transition. Yeah, the assessment manager is there to support all things accreditation. I know there have been a lot of changes with assessment managers while we've doubled our number of assessment managers over the last few years. So there's been lots of chopping and changing, but we're very stable now. So the AMs are there to help. So yeah, certainly build up that relationship with them.
Fantastic. So next question, do we need to provide objective evidence of compliance to major or new changes if we submit no gap as part of our gap analysis?
Yes.
That's a nice, easy one.
Because from our point of view, it is a major gap. It may be that in individual services, people have different ways of interpreting the 2012 version. If a service thinks UKAS is saying this is major, we've been doing that for years, we're fine. Submit the policy, procedure, or whatever the evidence is, because that just saves the conversation with the assessment manager on site, who will pick up on that if there's no evidence submitted.
Great, thank you. For clause 7.3, if there is a verification template with acceptable criteria that has been signed off by clinical staff, so that acceptance part right at the beginning,
yeah,
would the clinician still need to sign off every acceptable verification? Do they need to be involved in it all the way through to the end?
Yes. So I'm just running through the scenario.
We set our acceptance criteria at the beginning of a verification. Yeah. If that verification runs through and it meets the acceptance criteria with nothing outstanding or no issues, would it be acceptable for the senior biomedical scientist that were running it, the technical lead in that department, to be able to sign that off instead of requiring further clinician sign off? Is how I read that question.
Okay. I think, again, it's very much going to depend on the service and what the test is and the risk, because I hesitate to give examples, but yeah, if you've got a fairly straightforward test that's being developed, implemented, and say the clinical staff have had that input in the first place, and it's very easy, if it's a yes/no answer of, I don't know, whatever the test is, and the biomedical scientists are competent to authorise it. It comes back to the authorisation side of things as well. Are they authorised to sign off that verification? I would proceed down that route with caution, because the whole point of the standard is, as we keep saying, it's about risk, it's about patient impact, it's about the patient sort of journey, etc. So to not have clinical sign off for a new method just worries me slightly, but I'm sure there'll be some scenarios where it's a fairly straightforward method that could be managed without, but it'll come down to each individual scenario, and again that authorization for sign off.
I suppose playing that forward as well is understanding the role of where some of our advanced biomedical scientists come in, and where they are trained and competent to authorise and provide that clinical input. We're starting to grey those lines a little, but it's about understanding the clinical impact and therefore the risk to the patient as part of understanding the verification.
Absolutely, and I think it's worth just saying when we talk about clinical inputs, historically, we say clinical, we mean consultant. That isn't the case now. This is all about, I feel like I'm channeling David Ricketts now, but it's all about the sign-off being competent to do, you're trained and competent to do what you do. If you are a biomedical scientist in an advanced role, and if you're a clinical scientist, whatever your role is, as long as you are trained and competent and authorised to sign off that verification because you've got that clinical knowledge, frankly, I don't care what the job title is.
Yeah, and it's referenced back to 6.2.3, isn't it? And what you talked about right at the beginning around personnel authorization. Are you trained, competent, and signed off to do that level of delegated task that has been assigned to you as part of the quality management system? So yeah, great. Okay, one that we'll pull across from the Q&A bit. Some are in the chat, some are in the Q&A. So we have had a department within our trust that was recommended for 2022. Congratulations. Yay, successfully well last year. Brilliant. And therefore all pan-pathology documentation and processes are now compliant to that standard. For the remaining disciplines who are undergoing their transition, the gap analysis will now show compliance for these. Is it okay to submit the other gap analyses as compliant for the relevant clauses without evidence, or will they be required to resubmit? I like again, challenging Al. It's good when she does her thinking face, guys.
You can see the brain and the steam. I think that's another discussion with your assessment manager, because I'm conscious that I've assessed pan-pathology documentation in the past, and the overarching procedure might be fine, but it's the implementation in each individual service. So a classic example is you've got a single non-conformity management policy pathology-wide. It might be brilliantly implemented in CellPath, because that would be my discipline, so it'd be perfect. It might be horrendously implemented in pick your other discipline of choice. So I would have a chat with your assessment manager in advance, say, what do you actually want? Because they might not want that overarching policy, but they might want examples of implementation per discipline.
Great. Thank you. A risk one. Let's move to risk. So a risk-based approach to audit, but do you still need to audit your whole scope of accreditation?
Depends on your risk. I love this standard because genuinely, it always sounds really flippant when I say it, but it really does involve the staff who are setting up the audit schedule or do whatever the compliance with 15189 is. You know your service. So I would tread with caution if you're not going to audit everything quite frequently. You may be able to justify, let's use a ridiculous scenario. If there's a test you only do once every 2 years, you can't audit it annually. Although you could look at EQA. Anyway, there's a whole conversation there. It's up to you to justify the risk. The old standard said was everything annually, but paraphrasing, you could touch on things more in depth or less in depth.
Yeah, light touch.
Yes, yeah. The new standard doesn't say that. So it really is up to each lab. If you are going to not audit every year, I think you've got to have a very solid justification of that. Equally, most things are touched on. We look at turnaround times. Every lab audits or monitors or reviews their turnaround times. That's going to cover every test. Most we'll keep an eye on
EQA.
Yeah, EQA. Yeah. So I think labs it's a good opportunity to think about what is an audit and what the scope of the audit is. Do you just say for the bread and butter, everybody genuinely knows how to do it and is competent and is great and this method has never changed? Do you just do an audit every other year with a look at EQA and turnaround times in between to keep an eye on that risk and that clinical impact? I'm not saying that's the way to do it. I'm just throwing ideas.
And again, the standard is written so that we have to justify our approach to how we're dealing with this. It gives us the opportunity to have that discussion with our assessment manager and how we go through that process. So I encourage people to challenge when findings are raised and really go through that evidence-based conversation with your assessors and your assessment manager.
Yep, me too. Challenge nicely, though. We're all human.
Oh, absolutely.
But,
kind and polite at all times.
Exactly,
we still have standards that we have to adhere to for our professional practice. There is one here around ISO 22367, which we obviously know is the risk management for medical laboratory standard. Do we need to buy that as part of assessing to 15189? Obviously, it's not the world's shortest standard.
It's not. So no, you don't have to buy it. I think I've seen that the comment in the chat, and you're absolutely right. We are assessing and accrediting to 15189. So there are risk management requirements in 15189. If you're a little bit uncertain about where to start with risk management, if you want a bit of extra guidance, a bit of extra assurance about that what you're doing is right and is appropriate, 22367 can support with that. So it is very much a supported document. I know it's long, and I know I'm a geek, but it is quite readable. And there's some of the standards. Yeah, you do read some and go, I just can't. But for 22367, it's very applicable. So no, you don't have to buy it. It would seem sensible, given that this is a risk-based standard and the world is risk-based, it would seem sensible to consider it maybe within a trust wire, have one copy in a trust or whatever is appropriate.
Yeah, that's great. I'm very aware we are now 1 minute to past, and people have jobs to get back to and on all that side of things as well. Nigel, some ringing endorsements for you in the chat. It looks like we're going to have to work out how to provide a risk management training session, but I'm sure that we can pick some of that up as we kind of move forward. So yeah, things to think about. I'm just going to flick my screen back up just as we kind of pull this to a close, because Nigel and I and Al all have to get to the IBMS Quality Management Specialist Advisory Panel meeting next. But just to highlight and to signpost some of the things, the UKAS website is fantastic. It lists all of the transition arrangements, all the documentation, all the technical policy statements that Al's referenced today. They are all on there. If you haven't got a copy of the standard, you need to get that and you need to read and inwardly digest it. We've done a whole series of articles, and this is only a few of those listed on the screen. But please take the time, look at the biomedical scientist, and Al, I think you've done a more recent one about even becoming an assessor. It's all good stuff. So please take the time to really have a look at what's available to you. Just as we close, and again, huge thank you to everyone who has joined this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you at future events. We'll continue on that trend and trend analysis piece as more of us go through the sessions. And really the next session, we would really like to be able to share some of the experiences. So if we use it as a lessons learnt piece, that's probably where we get the most benefit from. So please look out for the correspondence coming in around that. In the meantime, you need to read your standard, you need to complete your gap analysis, and make sure you've signed up for all of that support. Thank you to our fantastic speakers today. I'm sure you will all join me in saying a huge thank you for their time that they've put into the presentations today and for their huge amount of expertise. We will make the recording available on the website, and if our speakers are happy to share, I know Nigel has said that he is, we'll also make the slides available. Al's also nodding, so that's fantastic. And we'll take the time to also go back through the questions that we haven't been able to address today. So please do still put them in the chat, and we'll pick them up as part of an FAQ to also get onto the website alongside the recording. But thank you ever so much for everyone joining. Good luck in your transition journey. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic for the benefit of our patients. So thank you. Bye.